Right now, on the streets of downtown Manhattan, people are pushing fluffy dogs in luxury zippered strollers. These dogs eat pasture-raised salmon, sleep on memory foam mattresses, and wear cashmere sweaters. We have become a society that went from fighting off cave bears with sharpened wooden spears to ordering grain-free, wild-caught salmon pâté for a 9-pound French bulldog who is actively afraid of her own farts. If you trace that dog's DNA back through the layers of the earth, you don't find a toy or a modern luxury. You find an apex predator. You find a massive, calculating pack hunter roaming a sub-zero wasteland, fully capable of tearing a human being to pieces in seconds. So what was the plan here? How did we go from an endless war with wild carnivores to letting their descendants sleep on our pillows? We usually imagine that humans are the master designers of nature, that our brilliant ancestors captured wild wolf pups, put them in cages, and used dominant human training to breed them into tools for the hunt. But that's completely backwards. The truth is much stranger. Your dog does not love you because you are a master trainer, or even because you buy the good food. Your dog loves you because its ancestors suffered from a highly specific, accidental, genetic brain condition. A few years ago, a team of evolutionary geneticists at Princeton University, led by Dr. Bridget von Hold, sat in front of a row of high-resolution sequencer screens, trying to map the exact molecular line that separates a friendly domestic dog from a cold, distant wolf. When they isolated a specific 5 megabase region on canine chromosome 6, the screen lit up with mutations. They found a massive concentration of structural variants, essentially pieces of jumping DNA, that had slipped into the code. That matters because in humans, a disruption in that exact same genetic neighborhood causes something called Williams-Beuren syndrome. It is a rare developmental condition. The psychological profile of a human patient with Williams syndromes includes intense, indiscriminate hypersociability, an insatiable desire for physical proximity, an absolute lack of social fear, and a structural bias in the brain that forces them to stare endlessly at human faces. While humans experience this personality profile through a genetic deletion, canines achieved the exact same psychological malfunction through a genetic insertion. The transposable DNA elements acted as a molecular silencer, permanently turning down the volume on the wolf's natural defense mechanisms. Your dog is not a trained wolf. Your dog is a genetic mutant hardwired with a permanent, uninhibited friendliness syndrome that makes it physically incapable of treating a stranger like an enemy. It is the ultimate evolutionary heist. By accidentally scrambling their own brains to mimic the desperate emotional attachment of human infants, a small group of ancient canines managed to turn their primary predators, us, into their lifetime personal caretakers. But a genetic glitch on a chromosome doesn't just happen in a vacuum. A broken brain mutation is usually a death sentence in the wild. To understand how this accidental vulnerability didn't get these animals killed, and how it completely upended the survival logic of the human species, we have to look at the environment that forged the contract. We have to go back to a time when the world was dying of cold. To understand how that mutation actually survived, we have to strip away everything that makes your life comfortable. No walls, no supermarkets, no thermostat, no emergency line to call when something makes a sound in the brush. Just your body, a flickering fire, and a blinding sub-zero blizzard screaming across the open tundra. This was the world between 20,000 and 40,000 years ago, during the coldest peak of the last ice age. It was a landscape of frozen grass and moving mammoth herds, and it was entirely a zero-sum game. Humans and wolves were not neighbors. They were business rivals hunting the exact same meat. If the wolves took down a horse, the humans starved. If the humans killed a bison, the wolves went hungry. And when resources are that tight, nature doesn't reward cooperation. It rewards teeth. But here is the twist. Your dog's relationship with us wasn't a clean, cinematic fairy tale that happened perfectly on the first try. It was a messy, high-stakes disaster that failed multiple times before it ever worked. Deep inside Goyet Cave in Belgium and hidden away in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, archaeologists have uncovered canid skulls dating back over 32,000 years. When you look at them under a scanner, they aren't normal wolves. Their snouts are shorter. Their jaws are wider. They look exactly like early, experimental versions of a dog, For a long time, people thought these fossils were the legendary grandfathers of our modern pets. But when geneticists finally pulled the ancient DNA out of those bones, the data hit them with a cold realization. These lineages completely died out. They were evolutionary dead ends, wiped from the earth by the advancing glaciers of the Ice Age. Imagine an ancient human band wandering through a blinding whiteout, huddling against a rock face with their early canid companions, only for the cold to become so absolute that the partnership simply snaps. Both species freeze. The slate is wiped clean. Nature is rude like that. Domestication wasn't a master plan. It was a desperate cycle of trial and error. But once the worst of the glaciers began to recede, the boldest survivors on both sides realized they had to change the rules of the game. And they didn't do it by hunting together. They did it through a very disgusting, very successful backyard treaty. We like to think of ancient humans as heroic hunters, taming the wild with raw courage. We imagine a prehistoric warrior looking into the eyes of a fierce wolf, asserting dominance and forcing it to bend to human will. But the reality is a lot less glorious. The first dog was probably just an incredibly practical, slightly lazy wolf who realized that digging through prehistoric trash heaps was infinitely easier than chasing a 2-ton bison through a blizzard. Our greatest evolutionary partnership wasn't born out of human dominance. It was born out of garbage. When Paleolithic hunting camps stayed in one place for a while, they produced an astronomical amount of waste. We are talking massive piles of animal bones, stripped marrow chunks, and human metabolic waste sitting right on the edge of the camp. Left unattended, those rotting heaps were a massive safety hazard. They smelled like a free buffet, and they attracted the kind of night guests you really didn't want showing up, like cave bears and massive, aggressive wild cats. But a few wolves from an extinct, highly social lineage decided to play a completely different game. Most wild wolves had a massive flight distance, meaning if a human got within half a mile of them, their adrenaline spiked and they bolted. But the individuals carrying those weird little chromosome mutations we talked about didn't run. They conquered their own fear just enough to hang around the margins of the camp. The wolves that didn't run away got the bones. The terrified ones stayed out in the cold and starved. Over generations, these camp follower wolves actively self-selected for low adrenaline and low aggression. Humans didn't domesticate the dog. The dog successfully domesticated itself by turning our dumpster piles into an evolutionary niche. And pretty soon, humans realized these garbage-eating mutants were actually the best home security system money couldn't buy. The human visual system is notoriously terrible in the dark, leaving our ancestors incredibly vulnerable to a midnight ambush. But these proto-dogs possessed ears and noses that could read the dark like a book. By sleeping on the muddy perimeter of the camp to guard their favorite trash piles, they became a living biological tripwire. If a hostile predator or a rival human band tried to sneak up in the pitch black, the perimeter would erupt into a wall of aggressive barking. The camp would wake up, grab their spears, and survive the night. But during the brutal winters of the Ice Age, these animals solved an even more immediate metabolic problem: staying warm. While humans huddled inside mammoth bone huts, these canids were eventually invited inside to sleep right on the periphery of the bedding quarters. They became a highly efficient, furry heat barrier. This is the literal origin of the historical phrase, a 3-dog night. A night so terrifyingly cold that you legally required 3 living, breathing, 90-pound hot water bottles draped over your body just to prevent hypothermia. By cleaning up the trash, absorbing the cold, and screaming at the dark, these animals ceased to be tolerated pests. They became part of the family. But it's one thing to let a friendly alarm system sleep on your floor for its body heat. It is something else entirely to love it when it can no longer do its job. 14,000 years ago, a puppy was born in what is now Germany. It was a member of the Magdalenian culture, a group of late Paleolithic hunter-gatherers trying to piecemeal a life together as the world slowly thawed. This puppy had no hunting skills. It couldn't track a deer. It couldn't protect a camp. And it was eventually too weak to even stand up on its own 4 legs. In a world where every single calorie mattered, where a bad winter meant half your group didn't wake up in the spring, keeping a useless animal alive was a terrible business decision. It was a net negative on your metabolic budget. Yet, In 1914, workers in a basalt quarry in Oberkassel uncovered an ancient double burial containing a young woman, a middle-aged man, and the complete skeleton of that exact puppy. For a long time, scientists assumed it was just a working hunting dog buried with its masters. But recently, a team of researchers decided to run a microscopic forensic analysis on the puppy's teeth. What they found completely shattered the myth of the cold, purely transactional caveman. Etched horizontally across the puppy's teeth were deep, microscopic defects, lines that look exactly like the rings inside a sick tree trunk. In veterinary science, this is what happens when a young animal gets hit by a massive, life-threatening fever during its development. The lines prove that between 19 and 23 weeks of age, this puppy was hit by 3 separate, consecutive waves of canine distemper. Distemper is a brutal, agonizing virus. It attacks the nervous system and the stomach. It causes violent seizures, blinding discharge in the eyes and nose, and endless rounds of lethal vomit and diarrhea. In the wild, without modern medicine, a puppy with distemper dies in days. It dehydrates, starves, or gets eaten by something else. But this puppy didn't die in days. The lines on its teeth show it survived those 3 waves for over a month, finally dying of a later relapse at 27 weeks old. The only way a paralyzed, seizing animal can survive lethal distemper for weeks in a prehistoric rock shelter is if a human being is sitting next to it, manually dropping water into its mouth, keeping it wrapped in warm deer hides, and physically cleaning its skin of foul waste day after day after day. This animal provided absolutely zero functional utility to the group. It was a drain on their water, a drain on their space, and a drain on their energy. We usually assume that our ancestors only kept animals around when they could use them as tools. But 14,000 years ago, someone looked at a shivering, dying ball of fur that could give them absolutely nothing in return, and they chose to hold it in the dark anyway. When it finally died, they didn't toss it into the garbage heap outside. They lined a grave with basalt blocks, sprayed the puppy's body with sacred red ochre powder, laid it next to their own dead, and placed an elk antler carved with a deer head into the dirt beside it. It turns out, pure, non-utilitarian cross-species compassion is older than agriculture, older than cities, and written into the very foundation of our species. But once the Ice Age fully broke and humans stopped wandering, this private act of campfire mercy turned into an absolute biological lockdown. Our bodies and our brains began to alter their own internal chemistry to make this bond permanent. As the Ice Age fully broke, humans did something that changed the rules of geography forever. They stopped running. About 12,000 years ago in the Levant, a group of semi-sedentary foragers known as the Natufian culture built the world's very first permanent stone base camps. They built stone-walled houses, collected wild grains, and settled down. And when we look into the earth where they lived, we find that the backyard garbage treaty had officially been upgraded into a full cross-species romance. In 1978, at a site called Ain Malaha in modern-day Israel, archaeologists digging into the clay floor of an ancient stone dwelling uncovered a grave. Inside was a human skeleton laid to rest on its side, tucked into a flexed fetal position. But as the researchers carefully brushed away the orange Mediterranean dust with their dental picks, the entire excavation team froze. Draped gently over the thorax and ribs of a 3 to 5 month old puppy skeleton was the fossilized left hand of the human. Here is the thing nobody talks about. This grave is 12,000 years old. That means long before humans built the first pyramid, long before we invented the wheel, and millennia before we even learned how to plant a single seed of wheat. We already knew exactly how to hold a puppy's paw as we died. No agricultural wealth, no complex civilization, just a hand on a chest, frozen in stone. Why did our ancestors let a predatory carnivore cross the absolute, sacred boundary of our graves? It wasn't because the puppy was a useful tool for hunting. A 3-month-old puppy can't bring down a gazelle. It happened because canines had spent the last few thousand years executing a flawless, brilliant psychological trick. They figured out how to manipulate the neurobiological software of the human brain. In the wild canid world, a direct, sustained stare is an absolute declaration of war. If you look a wild wolf directly in the eyes, its brain reads it as an aggressive dominance display. Even wolves that have been hand-reared by human scientists from the day they open their eyes will actively avoid making direct eye contact with humans as they mature. But domestic dogs did something wild. They mutated that ancient threat display into a tool for emotional extortion. When a dog looks up at you today and holds your gaze, a highly precise hormonal feedback loop triggers inside your nervous system. Your brain reads that wide-eyed look and instantly responds with a staggering 300% spike in urinary oxytocin, the exact same chemical cascade that bonds a human mother to her newborn infant. When you feel that soft, melting rush of affection and pet the dog or speak to it, its brain answers with a 130% oxytocin spike of its own. Modern brain imaging has confirmed that when childless adults view pictures of their dogs, the highly overlapping reward and attachment centers of the brain light up in identical patterns to a mother looking at her biological baby. Dogs didn't just join our camps. They hacked our mammalian maternal biology so deeply that we became physically, chemically incapable of letting them go. But while dogs were busy conquering our hearts by looking at us like needy human infants, early humans were about to sign a second animal alliance. And this one was with an independent, solitary killer who didn't give a single damn about our feelings. If you have ever tried to force a modern house cat into a plastic carrier to take them to the vet, you already know it is a screaming, claw-filled nightmare. Now imagine trying to take a raw 15-pound, razor-clawed Mediterranean wildcat and loading it onto a primitive wooden raft to cross 50 miles of open, pitching sea. You have no life vests, no engine, and no GPS. If the cat panics and attacks your legs, you capsize and drown. If it leaps overboard, it's dead. Yet, about 9,500 years ago, that is exactly what our ancestors did. For generations, we were taught that cats were first domesticated in ancient Egypt to protect the granaries of the pharaohs. It's a great story, but it's completely wrong. The Egyptian era was just the phase where cats were deified and bred, not the origin of their domestication. Their actual journey into our lives began thousands of years earlier, on the islands of the Mediterranean. In 2004, archaeologists digging at the Neolithic site of Shilulurokambos on the island of Cyprus uncovered a grave. Inside was a human skeleton, but just a few inches away, in the exact same burial pit, they found the completely intact skeleton of a young wildcat, known scientifically as Felis sylvestris libica. Here is the catch. Cyprus is an oceanic island. It has been completely cut off from the mainland since its geological formation. No native wildcat species has ever lived there. The only physical way a cat could have lived, died, and been buried in that dirt 9,500 years ago is if a Neolithic human physically captured it on the mainland and rowed it across 50 miles of Mediterranean waves on a boat. This completely destroys the popular narrative that cats are just passive roommates who happen to wander into our barns out of boredom. Our ancestors actively chose them. They risked drowning at sea for them. But why would a group of early pioneers, struggling to settle a new island, take a hyper-aggressive, solitary, completely untrainable predator on a dangerous maritime voyage? To understand that, you have to look at the terrifying new crisis that human success had just created on the mainland. When humans invented farming, we unintentionally declared a global war against starvation, and we were losing. About 9,000 years ago, during the Neolithic agricultural transition, human groups across the Fertile Crescent stopped wandering and began piling up massive surpluses of grain. It was a monumental achievement for our species, but to the natural world, a mud brick barn full of harvested barley was just a giant flashing neon sign that read, "Free all-you-can-eat buffet." Almost instantly, a silent army of millions of mice and rats descended on our grain stores, eating our survival. Early farmers couldn't trap them, they couldn't poison them, and they couldn't stop them. In the ancient world, a rodent infestation wasn't just an annoying household nuisance. It was a literal death sentence for a village. If the pests destroyed your grain reserves before the first frost, your children simply did not survive the winter. But then, a solitary, green-eyed killer stepped out of the shadows. The North African wildcat looked at our early human settlements and didn't see the birth of human civilization. It saw a highly concentrated, incredibly target-rich rodent hunting ground, and humans looked at these tiny, quiet stalkers and realized they were looking at the ultimate automated defense system. This was the birth of the feline contract. But unlike the dog, who completely scrambled its own chromosome code to become our hyper-friendly, needy emotional shadow, the cat signed a strict peer-to-peer business agreement. They offered their lethal predatory speed to defend our food supply, and in exchange, we gave them a warm, safe place to sleep next to the grain stores. We never asked them to change their wild souls, and frankly, they never intended to. Even today, if you map the genome of a modern domestic house cat, it remains almost entirely unchanged from the wild solitary stalkers that prowled the Neolithic sand. Your cat is not a biological novelty bred to obey you. It is an independent apex predator that simply tolerates your existence because you provide an excellent rodent infrastructure and premium central heating. Meanwhile, the agricultural revolution was hitting our very first companions, the dogs, in a much more brutal, physical way. While cats were enjoying a pure meat diet of grain-fattened mice, dogs were facing a severe metabolic crisis. Meat was suddenly scarce. Humans were no longer bringing home tons of fresh mammoth joints and wild horse carcasses from the frozen tundra. Instead, early agricultural societies were living on a tight budget of wheat porridge, boiled millet, and starchy agricultural waste. A wild wolf cannot survive on carbs. They are obligate carnivores. Their bodies lack the genetic machinery to break down complex plant starches. If you feed a wild wolf a diet of pure human porridge leftovers, its digestive tract eventually fails and it dies. So canine evolution did something absolutely wild. It rewired the dog's internal organs to match our trash. Wild gray wolves possess exactly 2 copies of a gene called AMI2B, which controls the production of pancreatic amylase, the enzyme required to digest starch. But about 7,000 years ago, as dogs embedded themselves into farming villages, their DNA began to mutate and duplicate. Modern domestic dogs do not have 2 copies. They have anywhere from 4 to 34 copies of that exact same gene. They literally multiplied their own internal digestive switches just to survive on our leftovers. Your dog didn't just adapt to your lifestyle psychologically. Its pancreas physically mutated to copy your diet. They transformed from majestic Ice Age megafauna hunters into ultimate carbohydrate-wielding garbage heap specialists. By the time the ancient world gave way to the modern era, the fundamental contracts of our home were complete. The dog had traded its wild diet and structural fear for human porridge and unconditional love. The cat had traded its solitary island isolation for a lifetime contract as a sovereign protector of our survival. But this ancient cross-species alliance wasn't designed to stop at the edge of a Neolithic farm. Thousands of years later, these creatures would follow us into a completely new kind of landscape, an environment so artificial, isolated, and emotionally hostile that it would force our very first pets to take on their most difficult, highest-stakes job yet. Now, let's bring this entire story all the way home. Back to the high-rise concrete canyons of the modern United States. Today, pet ownership in America has skyrocketed to an all-time high, jumping from 56% in 1988 to a staggering 66% of all households. That means roughly 86 million American homes are currently sharing their living spaces with a domestic animal. At the exact same time, the national human birth rate has plummeted to historic lows, dropping 20% over the last 15 years alone. That is not an accident. It is a massive, structural socio-economic pivot. For generations of young adults facing stagnant wages, high inflation, and a completely broken housing market, the financial reality of raising a human child, which currently costs over $300,000 in the US before they even hit college, is completely impossible. So, the modern human brain did what it has always done when resources get tight and environments get hostile. It adjusted. It went looking for an alternative. Over 98% of young pet owners in the United States now explicitly state that raising an animal is simply easier and more affordable than raising a human baby. And the market has responded by treating these creatures exactly like human infants. We have built a multi-billion-dollar industry around organic human-grade meal deliveries, canine acupuncture, and zipper-faced strollers. We don't call them working tools anymore. We call them fur babies and soulmates. But this intense emotional substitution has pushed human psychology into some incredibly weird, deeply uncomfortable territory. Recently, sociologists ran a series of psychological surveys on childless dog owners across the country, presenting them with a classic high-stakes moral dilemma. If a runaway car was speeding down the road and you could only choose to save a human stranger or your own dog, which one do you pick? Nearly 20% of the respondents admitted, in a blind study, that they would let the human being die to keep their dog alive. On paper, that looks like a total biological malfunction. Evolution is supposed to hardwire us to protect our own species above everything else. Letting a fellow Homo sapiens get crushed to save a different animal should be a fatal flaw in our genetic code. But if you understand the deep history of our pets, you realize it's not an error at all. It is the logical conclusion of a 40,000-year-old survival strategy. We like to think that treating animals like children or dating partners is a bizarre, modern psychological illness caused by social media and lonely cities. But that's completely backwards. We aren't breaking the rules of human nature, we are returning to them. When you sit alone at night in a cold, sterile urban apartment, staring into the blue light of your smartphone screen while the stress of a modern job makes your chest tight, your biology doesn't realize you are safe inside a luxury skyscraper. Your nervous system is still running on the old, primitive Paleolithic software. To your brain, the isolation of modern city life feels exactly like the terrifying zero-sum wasteland of the Ice Age mammoth steppe. Your body thinks it is exposed, alone, and tracked by things in the dark, and so, your heart instinctively seeks out the exact same cross-species sanctuary that kept us alive through the freezing glacial blizzards. Your modern apartment isn't a high-rise investment. It's just a cave. Your phone is just a tiny, glowing ember from a dying fire. The outside world is still loud, cold, and incredibly indifferent to whether you survive. But when that small, floppy-eared genetic mutant walks over, places its chin on your knee, and holds your gaze until your brain floods with oxytocin, or when that independent, wild-souled Neolithic hunter climbs onto your chest and starts to purr, the ancient contract is renewed. You aren't alone anymore. Your body relaxes. Your heart rate slows. And the perimeter is secure. We didn't design these creatures to be toys, and they didn't choose us to be tools. We are co-evolutionary soulmates. For tens of thousands of years, they have been the living shields keeping the coldness of the universe at bay. And as long as the world outside remains dark and uncertain, we will keep sharing our porridge. We will keep holding their paws in the dirt. And we will keep letting them sleep on our pillows.